But then at the end, we're going to share it with everyone as well as the recording, so you can access this at a later point, especially for those of you that might not be heading on the job market this year, but next year or the year after, you can kind of refer back to it. Okay, so we'll start off with a sentence from all the faculty about your current position, and then what specific expertise you have when it comes to the job market. So whether that's having been on a bunch of panels or committees, or whether that's actually having applied to a ton of jobs recently. Jay, do you want to start?
Okay, my name is Jay Van Bavel. I'm a professor of psychology in the social psych area. I'm on the social psych area. I'm the coordinator there. And I've been on many search committees, including in developmental and CMP area, as well as multiple and social. And I have also, for a long time, for many years, I had a column in Science Careers, which gave professional career advice. So I write a lot and talk a lot about these issues.
Eric Knowles, professor in the psychology department. Well, one qualification, through some miraculous twist of fate, I actually have a job. And it wasn't easy getting there, but I, thank my lucky stars every day that I'm employed. I've been like Jay on many a search committee. I'm co-chairing a search that we have going on right now in the social area and the psych department. So I hopefully have some good information about that process and maybe some much.
Hi, I'm Ashwini Ashok Kumar. I'm an assistant professor, 1 year in, starting year 2, in the social psychology area. Also very thankful to have a job. Not been on a search committee, but definitely recently been on the job market. I think 3 times almost, something like that. In those times, I'd like to psych jobs, but also business school jobs. And
I'm Mark Ho. I am also a history professor in the psychology department. I was previously assistant professor in the computer science department at Stevens in Hoboken. Yeah, my position here is kind of joint between CMP and social psychology. I'm on the social psych job committee this year. I was on the job committee at Stevens also, so I have some experience being on the job committee and the computer science side. Yeah, and I've been on the job market 3 times, once in 2021, which was like the bad COVID year, 2022, and then this past year.
Amazing. Great. Thank you. So now we're going to start with the first crucial decision you're going to have to make, and that is deciding that you're ready to apply or that you want to go on the job market this year. And so the first question I actually have for everyone is, how do you know if you're ready or competitive enough to apply? I guess, Mark, how did you make that decision when you started?
Yeah, I didn't feel ready, but my postdoc advisor was like, you should go on the job market. I had very low hopes because it was the year that COVID happened and there were like literally 4 jobs. But it was a really useful experience. Just like, I'm really glad I did that because it made it much easier to put my materials together the following year and like think a lot about like where I wanted to really put my head, what projects I wanted to put my energy into.
So would you recommend a kind of soft launch year, I guess, is what you're saying? Ashwini, how about you?
Very similar experience. I did not feel ready, and looking back, I was not ready. I think I just had no clue what to expect. I went the first time when I was about to graduate. So I was in my 5th year of grad school, and I knew, I think, that I wasn't ready, but I thought, kind of like we're saying, Mark, I wanted just to know what it was. One difference I'll say that I was at UT Austin. I think different schools are very different. I feel like at NYU, there's many postdocs coming in and out. There are many people, many of you may be on the job market. It wasn't like that where I was. There were maybe 1 or 2 people on the market every. You just didn't feel the vibe of it. You didn't know how to think about it. It just wasn't there around you. So I felt like the only way to learn is to do it. So my goal wasn't to get a job. My first year, it was just to have materials. That was my only goal. So I didn't even let myself have any expectations. I really had no clue, like I still applied to marketing jobs and stuff like that. But I think it helped me a lot in that I learned what goes into materials. It helps you look at other people's materials. And I didn't at all think I was ready, but I randomly got an interview also, which I still don't know how, but that I didn't get the job here, but it helped me again know what that looks like. So yeah, definitely I would say it's useful to try early. And the hard thing about the job market is, of course, it's psychologically stressful. It takes a lot out of you. But I think that first year it helped me a little bit to just go in not expecting anything. That's hard to maintain, but that was my starting.
So it sounds like both of you were basically told to apply and then you kind of followed what your advisor did. In that case, Eric and Jay, how do you decide when a postdoc or grad student should apply? And also something that struck me about the US, which is less common, I'd say, in Europe, is the fact that here, a lot of graduate students in their final year or even in their fourth year sometimes start applying for positions. How do you make that decision and what are the pros and cons?
I mean, it's a small sort of N of people that I've mentored who have gone on the academic job market. I've had a graduate student recently go into industry, which, I'm fully supportive of. And so and let's see, my student Mao went into consulting, as did my student Sarah Danuccio. So either I'm scaring people away from friend, but my student from a few years back, Pia Dietza, is assistant professor at UC Irvine. And with her, it was just, it felt like good timing. It felt like, it felt plausible, I think. And there was also the possibility of, postdocs, and I think she applied to some postdocs as well. She did. So I think that's another thing is like, you can apply to a mix of postdocs and tenure track jobs, as people frequently do. And that's another way of kind of splitting it up. And it just, I don't know, it felt like the right time. There were publications and, like a research niche that was well developed enough to present to schools and to potential postdoc mentors. So yeah, that's not a very big sample, but it's quite
So I have a larger sample because I've had a large lab here for a long time. I have 19 of my former students and postdocs who worked with me in my lab are now tenure track professors. And so what I do is I encourage them to do what your advisors did.
wow.
Yeah. It's Irish chocolate, I counted it. Because some of them are like secondary PhD students, I co-advise or publish stuff like that. Secondary postdocs, I publish it.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's clear those aren't all my primary. So yeah. Some of that old.
You can make my lab sound like a sleepy little.
Well, so what I do is I encourage them, like what your advisors did, is go on the market like selectively your first year, force you to get your materials ready. And you might think, well, it's a lost time. I want to like get publications out. So there's a decision there, but it's not really lost time in the long run because you'll need to write them up anyways the next year when you go on more broadly. So you get all that time back that it's not lost. And then it forces you to think about your identity and come up with a narrative of who you are. And you start to identify like the gaps in your application that you can spend the next year working on. And some students get lucky and they get that job their first year. And I've had several who like got it. They might have only had one interview, but they nailed it and they got the job. And they might have only had like I had one with like 4 publications. She got like an Ivy League tenure track job because she had some really good papers. And so you can get those jobs even before you might think you're ready. If you have something that's really cutting edge or interesting, you just fit what that search is looking for. So don't discount yourself. And then they usually go on subsequent years broader and broader. But I have a student this year who's applying, she told me, to 90 jobs, 90 professor jobs. That includes marketing, management, organizations, and psychology. And liberal arts colleges, research one universities, Ivy Plus schools, all of these types of things, and really broadly geographically. And so she's already has 3 preliminary interviews, 1 in-person interview. And I'm sure will get multiple offers this year just because she's on the market really broadly. Last year she went on, and I think it was demoralizing for her. I didn't even see her here, but she didn't get any calls, you know? But sometimes it takes that extra year to get an extra paper or 2. And this year her in-person interviews at Yale Business School. So it's like she already got one at one of the top places and she was shocked. And so it's like, you don't fully understand how it's going to unfold. So there's a lot of, how I think of the search is that the first batch of people who apply, which for our job last year was like 100 people, you know, to get on the short list of like the top 10 or 20, you need multiple publications, usually multiple first author. That's what matters. And then from there's a lot of randomness. So there's a lot of signal to go from the full application list to the short list or long list. And then from there, it kind of depends on fit and who's on the committee that year and what they're looking for. And you can't control that. And so your goal is just to get a good enough CV that you're on a lot of these long lists of 10 to 15 people. And at that point, there's some randomness you can't control, but try to get on as many of those lists. And that will, you know, lead to interviews. And then you practice your talk, you get good at it. And they'll have a different conversation. But that's why I would consider applying a lot. And because there's noise, you want to apply as many jobs as you can that you're potentially willing to take. And one way to do that, if you're constrained geographically or constrained because you only want a certain type of job, let's say a liberal arts job, you're just passionate about that. There's only like 8 of those each year or whatever. Then you'll want to apply as many cycles as you can. So it's like, you know, signal and noise. You want a large sample size for your studies because you want to maximize signal to noise ratio and root out random error. To do that with the job market, you have to have a high sample, as high as you can get a number of jobs you apply for.
Great. Okay. You've touched on a lot of things that we're going to talk about in a second in terms of where to apply. One thing you also mentioned was that there's a lot of steps involved in applying. So the kind of timeline you have to bear in mind when you start applying. I know a lot of us are on the job market right now or considering it for next year. Ashwini and Mark, when did you start preparing your materials for that job cycle? It's usually, I think, for the psych jobs, Steve, you know better, it's usually October, kind of September, October time is when a lot of the applications are due. When do you kind of get your act together and prep your materials? What would you recommend?
Couple of months before.
That summer,
Yeah.
I don't start putting things together. But they even like evolved over the course of like sending in applications and evolved over the course of cycles and yeah, I think that's why it's important to like actually start trying to apply to things. That like forces you to really start thinking concretely about how you want to present yourself.
These documents you make are like living documents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're living. Exactly.
That are never obsolete. It's just like it's like you have a CV, you have a research statement, and also have some teaching statement. And those are just these wonderful resources that you have sitting on your computers that you can always go back to. They're like it's the record of you, adding to it, but you also reshape it, you know, find, you know, better ways to frame it, or your research is going in different directions, so you want to emphasize some things over another. But yeah, you certainly do produce a first draft of these, but after that, it's really hard to remember, like, when did I sit down and write that? Because it's just been this.
It's a living document. Yeah.
When I got a job, I put it on my website. I had a teaching page, my teaching philosophy for my job application and my research statement to signal to grad students and undergrads what I do. And so you can use it even for that. And I would even argue, as soon as you start drafting these things, when you go in the market, it's also great if you have a Google Scholar page and a website. So faculty who are like looking at searches can go there and read more about what you do. And you can have updated your statement at any point. And also if you got paper in, and then you look in your Google Scholar and you keep it updated, they'll see, oh, this person has more papers since I looked at them. Maybe you become even more impressive because they can like see that you evolved.
One thing that we spoke about, Jay, recently was the timeline in terms of how to think about it, not just in terms of prepping your materials, but also kind of thinking about it for next year, for instance, prepping your project. So what to prioritize the year before. And you had a really interesting kind of perspective on that, like how I should think about finishing up my projects and prioritizing papers. Do you want
Yeah,
to?
so I'll say this, if you're like Laura's in her first year of postdoc, and she doesn't want to apply this year, but she's gonna apply next year. And so I said, okay, what matters is what's in press on your CV by September 1st of next year. So that's when the first job ads are, or September 15th.
Mm.
So I said, to get something in press, you have to have submitted it probably by January 1st. So what you should prioritize this semester is getting out any R&Rs, any new data, any new projects, get them under review as quickly as you can before January 1st. And then after that, in the second semester, you can focus on other stuff like starting new projects or whatever. But if you're getting ready to go in the job market, you should be thinking ideally like a year in advance about how you're going to situate yourself to maximize your probability of like having the strongest record. So kind of start from when you plan to go on and then work back from that. And then give yourself at least 8 months to or longer to get something in press. It doesn't matter if it's come out yet, but in press is really what matters.
You know, interesting question though. I'd be curious to know your thoughts. Like, what if you have a dilemma between something that might not be ready in time, but that is more central to your scholarly identity versus something that is a little more peripheral, but it's got a much better chance of being impressed by job.
Depends on how likely, what the probabilities of each are. I would say first author is what matters
Yeah.
in general. So like try to get your first author stuff out. When we do screening for some of our searches, that's often what's will get screened. It's not how many papers you have, but it's do you have a first author or two in a good journal? And SPSB did an analysis of who got jobs a couple years ago for a couple cycles, and the best predictor was, did you just have a first author tier 1 paper? And that was correlated with securing a job, and it was correlated about 0.3, 0.25.
Was that in social?
That was in social psych, but it was like a JPSB psych science, JP general, a paper like that. If your first author was the only thing, that was the single best predictor of did you get a professor job.
That really brings us to the next step in terms of where to apply. So Jay, you've already mentioned there's one of your students or postdocs who's applying to 90 different positions. Now, I assume that's not really the normal range. So what I would like to know is, how do you make that decision in terms of where to apply? How much attention should you pay to fit, or did you pay to fit? For instance, if there's positions that are very specific and maybe there's a vague fit, or should you only really apply to positions that you want and that you're a very good fit for? Ashwini and Mark, how did you make that decision?
I was kind of geographically concerned. So that was a consideration, but I mean, yeah, you should generally apply to places that you think that you would be interested in being at, because, you know, that's where you want to be, but also like, I think you don't have to know 100%, like you are learning about the place and they're learning about you throughout the process. So I think, yeah, something that you're learning about the place is part of the process.
Yeah, my answer is similar. I think I was maybe less locationally constrained. For me, one of the questions was, should I apply just in psych or also in business schools? I just didn't know much about business schools, and I realized that just going through the process is a great way to learn, because meeting people and interviewing people, you kind of, at least in my experience, I had great conversations, and in some instances felt like I could be in a business school, which I wouldn't have expected. The first time I applied, I kind of honestly randomly just did it because people around me did it. I just didn't have a clear sense of what I was doing. And so number of places I applied to, probably, I think over the years, something between 15 and 40, depending on year. But I don't think I applied to maybe, I think one thing I knew was I wanted to do research, so I didn't apply to teaching, like this liberal arts schools or teaching focused schools. I only applied to research positions or schools that I thought were R1s. Yeah.
And Eric, how about you? You're on the search committee this year. How much attention are you going to pay to the fit of the candidate to the position?
Well, I guess there's a couple aspects to that, like, and this is partly because of the nature of this specific search is very broad. So we kind of say in the ad, we are going to take anyone who does any subfield, or we'll consider anyone who does any mainstream subfield of social psychology. And then we list like 10 different things which cover, 90% of what, what we study in social psychology. So fit is going to be a lot easier for people to have because it's so broad. if there are other searches in other years that, maybe you're looking, this isn't like specific, historical reference, but like, social neuroscience.
Mhm.
And that's what kind of search it is. And that's gonna, obviously, you're not gonna consider anybody who's not, got a proven record of research in
Mhm.
neuroscience. And so fit is critical, I would say, but searches vary a great deal in what you're trying to fit yourself to, if that makes sense. Sometimes it's like, we just want a really good social psychologist. And we don't have our sights set on somebody who does any specific subject. And that's a fit thing, but it's just easier.
Mhm. So-
I had a quick
course.
which maybe both of you can respond to. One advice I got, I think, is that it's often hard to know what exactly they're looking for, and it's better, they can exclude you, you don't have to exclude yourself. And often it's not that much more work to apply if you would like to actually go to that department, regardless of what they say on the ad. It's not that much more work because you've put your materials together anyway. So that's the thing I think I have followed a little bit. I mean, I don't know. That's not to say if they want something completely crazy, maybe it's useful to not to save that time. But I think on average, it's useful to just put your name. There's so much randomness. Put your name in the lot.
And if there's any uncertainty about whether you fit or not, you can kind of tell yourself, well, I'll let them decide.
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah.
That's,
I
yeah.
would say one other thing for art, like, I agree with exactly with what Shani said. Although some places are looking for a certain person, the dynamics can evolve based on the conversations in the committee and someone they just learn is leaving or retiring in the middle. We had one search where someone retired halfway through the search, and so we got permission to make an offer to a second person in the search. And that's happened a couple times. So like, and it was all of a sudden we originally wanted someone who could teach stats, like a quant person, but then the other person who retired wasn't quant. So then we had freedom to offer to anybody else in search. So put your name in the search. And the other thing people ask, we were going to debunk later, is if you don't get an offer, some students are always like anxious, like, well, I'm not that strong this year. I don't want to apply for like my dream job because if they turn me down this year, if it's open next year, I'll be much more stronger. I don't want them to like think worse of me. No one cares. No one does that.
No one remembers.
We forget each year. And by the way, there's some people who like are close to getting an interview. And we might not think they're strong to get in this year, but we keep our eye on them and we've talked about them, we've read their papers. We might invite them in a future year. I also had an interview when I was in the job market. I was at Dartmouth for a social neuro job, so I was a social neuro guy. And they thought I was not ready yet, I was too green. But then they emailed me like 3 years later and tried to recruit me there and gave me an offer. And so even though they didn't think I was good enough when they interviewed me, they kept their eye on me, brought me back for a talk later, and then tried to recruit me. And so like, don't take yourself out of the running prematurely.
Yeah.
You really don't know. And you just want to like, it's like, again, it's enough random chance. You want to buy as many lottery tickets as you can. It increases your
I
probability.
applied to NYU before. And
Okay.
I asked you, you didn't know.
Yeah, I didn't remember, you know.
Yeah, it's.
Well, because I was not like
Right.
This is like, yeah, and I wouldn't have remembered either of you applying. I knew you because I had read your papers as an editor and I really liked your work. And so it's like, did you apply to NYU like 1890?
No.
It's like hard to get.
Yeah, no, but I think what you said is true. It's like if the second time around, if it's the second time you've applied to NYU or anywhere else, and on the off chance somebody in that committee or in that faculty remembers you, like chances are they won't, right? But if they do, you must have done something to create like a positive impression, even if you weren't, because to be remembered, that means you probably got on the long list or caught the eye of somebody and maybe they didn't think you're ready that year or wanted to go in a slightly different direction with the search. So you really can't lose, because if you're worried about your reputation the second time around, A, they're not going to remember you, and if they do, they probably have a generally positive view of you, or else you just have sort of disappeared into the mists of time as far as that is.
I think another related thing that comes up is sometimes the same school has two jobs, same department has two jobs, and sometimes it's like they're different, looking for different things. Can I apply to both? Will I look like I don't have focus, I applied to both, nobody knows, those two search committees are not talking to each other.
And I'll say this, like, when I was in the job market, I had 2 interviews at East Chicago, one in psychology, one in the business school. And they were just both independent, they both independently invited me out, and the people from each search came and watched my talk at each place. And it was weird, and they're just like, don't be weird about it, like. And then I got an offer from the psych department about the business school, so it was just a better fit there. But it was like you could potentially get 2 interviews from 2 different searches, and they even told me that if they both like me, they would compete for me with each other. Because like, and so they obviously didn't both like me enough, but they made it clear to me that like you could potentially get 2 offers from the same school for different searches. And they'll figure it out on their own. So don't be shy about that. Like, yeah, it's not like dating where that can get you in trouble.
So if you get rejected, just go and try again. I think Lucina Udden has tried 8 times for UCLA. She put it on Twitter recently, until she got a position. So that's good encouragement, I'd say. Okay, that brings us to the next part, and that is, okay, so if we get rejected, definitely apply again. But what if you get the job that you thought you wanted, right? Or, you know, a job where you thought there was fit, but then you actually decide against it. Is that possible? Do you have to take the job that you get, assuming you only get that one job?
Wait, what? So wait, what's the scenario?
So the question is, what if you get a job you don't want? And that's the only job you've got that year? Because I know if you've got multiple jobs, you can buy them.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply this. I just thought you were at one job and you switched.
Oh, yeah. I like the old job.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know.
Assuming you didn't like it, would you have taken it?
I mean, I think that, you know, you learn, like I said, you learn things about the place as you know, get to know them, they get to know you, and you decide, you can update your belief about whether it's a good fit and make a decision based on that. Yeah, I mean, I haven't done that, but like, I know people do that.
I'll say my office lead in grad school got an offer at a school with her partner. They had 2 buddy club, both got offers at this one school. And they both decided they didn't want to live there. They were an interracial couple, and it was, I don't want to insult Texas, but it was Texas A&M, and they just felt like really uncomfortable. She felt really, like, I felt really comfortable there. And they didn't want to move there, and so they took postdocs instead. And then a couple years later, they got jobs at the University of Toronto, so they were like super happy. And so, and last year I had a postdoc, former student of mine on the market, now postdoc, and he got an interview at a place that I thought was pretty good. I would have taken if I was on the job market, and decided he didn't like it for whatever reason. And I asked, is there an offer they can make you that would recruit you? And he said, I don't think there's realistically an offer they can make me that can get me. And so I said, pull yourself out of the search. And it was like the day before the search committee was meeting. And so he just like emailed, withdrew his name, and they made an offer to other person. And then they hired someone who was other postdoc who's really happy to be. And so like they were happy, they got a person they liked. The other person got the job that they were happy about, and my former student didn't have to take something he didn't want. And so just like be quick and transparent and honest with it. And I don't think anybody will care.
So it sounds like almost the more the better, and just take the risk. You can always turn it down at the end.
As long as I think as long as you're willing to consider taking the job when you apply. Like don't apply to a place that you want to take it. But when you go there, you're allowed to learn more about the dynamics, the city, the vibe, the amount of money they'll give you for salary or startup, and decide this is not a good fit for me. But I wouldn't like waste anybody's time. I just want to be clear about that. But you're allowed to learn and update your thinking, because in an interview, you can learn way more than just like seeing a website. Like there's so much more to learn about the place.
Great. And so before we go on to the actual criteria, we've already touched on a bunch of different criteria that you're taking into account when you're applying, or that are considered for your application. But how has the academic job market changed over the years? Eric and Jay, what's unique, if anything, about this upcoming cycle? We've had that COVID was a particularly interesting time. Is there anything specifically about this year? There's a lot of job postings, it seems.
Yeah, it is a relatively good year, I think, right? Like I'm not really on that side of it, but that's the vibe I get. So that's different. I mean, during COVID it was terrible. I mean, I don't know if this is what you're getting at with the question, but, you know, I think that there's been like an evolution in just the way maybe generally search committees evaluate candidates. I can remember, you know, even a previous job being on, search committees, I think that there was too much of a focus maybe on bean counting and, you know, number of publications and having a really long, CV. And being maybe overly impressed by quantity. I don't know.
I agree with that, yeah.
And you know, I think like I was part of that, you know, to some degree, and maybe I was maybe a little too lured by that, but it's not unconnected to like the replication crisis and the open science movement that pushed committees, including this year's committee. And I would reckon it's pretty general in psych search committees these days, where there's really more of an interest in depth, and quality over quantity. I would so much rather consider a candidate with 1 or 2 or 3 or however many really just deep, good, thoughtful publications than somebody with, you know, the 30 underpowered priming studies. You know, it's like very 2010, right? Like, but at the time we had this conversation, we're too credulous about findings and not informed enough about like power. And also, like, I think humans are bandwidth limited beings. Like if you see somebody with, you know, 40 publications right out of grad school, there's like something weird. Like, or the pubs themselves are, you know, there's just no way you could have put like enough thought into those. And I hope it comes as good news that I think committees nowadays, definitely in my unit, definitely in our department, are trying to make like a very clear commitment to really getting to know the applicant's work and not being heuristic about it, like looking at how many publications the person has, or even exclusively where they are, right? Like it's great to have top journals, but sometimes really great influential work is in a good but not flagship journal, for instance. And that's the sense in which I think it's changed.
So it's quality over quantity. That's important for your application.
I mean, yeah, I mean,
That-
obviously the best is to have lots of high quality, but you
Everything.
know, but there's like, there has to be a trade-off because we're human beings, right? And I think that we're committed to doing that. And you know, I would say that, this is not like me, I would include myself in this criticism, is, you know, not really engaging with the person's work enough before the job talk in the lead up parts of the selection process, because that's where you kind of tend to think heuristically, oh, this person seems to be interesting, it's probably give a good talk, let's invite them out. So like for this, and maybe this is jumping the gun a little bit about like how we're organizing the search this year, but you know, we're trying to structure it so that all the faculty on the committee are not like are reading some of the work, you know, carefully, so that we don't get into this awkward position at the very end where we're like, you know, having deep reservations about candidates that should have come to light, that should have been apparent much earlier in the process, because that's just no one wins.
Absolutely.
I'll say another trend is there's certain things that are trendy, kind of like fashion. Like there's all kinds of fashion things that go in and out of style, certain haircuts, certain clothing. You know, when I was in the job market, what got hot that year for a couple of years was social neuroscience, because it's a hot area. A lot of departments wanted to get into it. There weren't that many people. And then once every department had hired 1 or 2 social neuroscientists, they were done. They're like, okay, we don't want too much of that. And so then they're balancing out other parts of the department. The last couple of years have been diversity science scholars, especially in social psych. You're not seeing that as much in the ads this year, because I think people have like, okay, you can't have a whole department on that unless you're like going all in. Usually want well-rounded programs and departments. One thing that always is in social psych, and I think in And computational approaches are kind of in right now in sociology and psychology. I would say another thing that tends to always be in is if you have quantitative skills in general, because almost every department needs people to teach stats and methods, especially at the undergrad level, but also grad level. Those are really important. And we just like had someone retire who taught all those courses, and our program's been suffering to find people like that ever since. And so, and that's like our most, I would say the most important thing for me in the search is finding people who can teach those classes and have those skills. And that's hard to find. So if you have like good skills, or you can teach, like a lot of people want you to come in and teach a service course, like intro psych or intro cog or intro social or intro developmental. And so if you'll make yourself very useful if you have the skills that signal that you could teach courses, because every department in the country and probably in the world has those courses. They have to fill them and they have to teach them well and mentor students in those areas. And so there is when no matter what topic gets hot or not hot, or what method gets hot or not hot, those seem to be like pervasive things that departments always like to get if they can.
Okay, that nicely brings us on to the criteria. Karina's gonna take over.
Okay, so in terms of putting your materials together and being a competitive candidate, when you're evaluating these things, what tips do you have, and this goes to Eric and Jay, about writing a compelling cover letter and tailoring materials to a specific school or program?
Cover letter specifically.
Cover letter, also maybe, other materials.
I'll say what Eric thinks. First of all, I wouldn't spend too much time tailoring your materials to each place. I think it's a waste of time. If you tailor anything, I should just have one paragraph in your cover letter that you tailor for each school. And I can say what is unique about that school that would be a great fit for you. And it could be specific faculty you could collaborate with, specific centers or resources that you tap into. That signals that like you thought about that place and know it. There might also be like unique geographic concerns. Like especially if it's a more obscure school, if you signal like that's where your family's from, or you uniquely like to live there for some other reason, that can often be a signal that they're looking for about like seriousness and willingness to come there to make you the offer. So I would definitely like have a few sentences in your cover letter, but I wouldn't tailor anything else too much.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, like if you can genuinely say there's something specific that's attractive about the university or the department that you're applying to, by all means say that. But you're the same person, applying to multiple jobs, and so there's not that much need, I think, to tailor it. I mean, if you're applying to a mix of like business schools and psychology departments, that's probably different. You probably want to come up with the B school version of your statement and the psych department version of your statement, but you don't have to probably get much more granular than that.
Yeah, with one exception, like let's say we asked for someone who can teach grad stats. Do you think you teach that and put that in your teaching statement?
Yeah.
Like there might be a couple things that you want to highlight if there's a specific call, so you can signal fit. But beyond that, I wouldn't waste too much time.
And maybe, drop that into the cover letter for that.
Awesome. So I do want to ask Ashwini and Mark, since you guys just did this, would you agree with everything that they said? Is that pretty much the advice that you guys followed? Is there anything else that you would add?
In my case, pretty much all that people said in general. I think it's useful to remember that, especially in the first round, I guess people spend like 5 minutes on your call on any document. There's 200, 300 people applying. So if there's something such as they're looking for someone to teach grad stats or whatever, it's useful to put that where it's visible, because I think sometimes someone I talked to said, but I already mentioned this in my other statement. I don't want to repeat or that kind of thing, but I think it's useful to repeat the things you want to highlight because you want to make it very quickly accessible. The faculty reading it are typically overloaded, don't have time, or finding some extra time in their weekend to do this. And so it's useful to keep that in mind and make it easier. Just like you, I think, would have when you were applying for grad school. But I didn't tailor much also, maybe one paragraph.
Can I add to one thing that Srini said? Everybody should know this. It's what advice I got, and I realize it's true. Your materials should survive like a 3-minute read and a 30-minute read. So that means they should be able to, because the first pass, Eric's gonna go through this in about a couple weeks. You're gonna get 100, 150 apps, and it's gonna go to 4 really busy overworked faculty members who are teaching, have kids, running their lab, writing grants, writing papers, managing reviews. And then they get 150 apps and they've got to trim it down to like 20 or 30. And each application is 100 pages single space. This is, if you say yes to the community or not. Did you say
Yeah, I didn't say yes.
Okay.
I see Eric like.
Yeah.
That's what I-
So how would any set of humans get through that? So that's where the first pass relies a lot on heuristics. So if you can bold things, have them stand out, that people can quickly at a glance see who you are and what you do, and see the things that are strong about you, that's what you're looking to do at the first pass. Okay? And then the second pass is now 30 or 20, Eric and the committee now done 30. Now all of us sit in a room and we all get those apps and we're all like, now you have 10 social psychologists reading them over the next 2 weeks. And we're all reading them more closely because we have to rate them and present them to the faculty. At that stage, there's a depth. And so you have to have like heuristic, signal, like clear markers and headlines and bolded things. And then also like thoughtful, nuanced writing that at the second stage, if you get to that people can read through. So you should think about your materials that way. And by the way, this is not different if you apply to non-academic jobs. You apply to non-academic jobs, the average time on each resume is about 30 seconds for the studies. That's why they tell people writing resumes to make it 1 page, because they're only gonna give it 30 seconds. So you better damn well put the most important things there so that a hiring manager or some algorithm, most of that's done by algorithms now, by the way, first pass, can see it. So get used to that. That's how humans are processing everything at the hiring level. So make sure what you have that's strong stands out. I always try to have my students clearly have their degree at the top, and then any major awards or publications should appear right at the top of their CV so people see it right away.
Yeah.
And their name is bolded so people can see what role they played on each paper. Stuff like that goes right at the top, and then all the other stuff kind of goes at the bottom of the CV. Again, because I know that's how people are processing it.
I was gonna say, like, I don't know if I'm representative in this regard, because I think every reviewer has their own sort of the triage of information, but like the CV is really an important resource for me if I'm like really limited in how long I can spend on the application. I'm thinking about it, simulating it in my mind. I'll probably go to the CV first. Cover letter, those tend to be pretty samey, honestly. Hi, this is who I am. Like, and you guys want to be good job. And again, I'm not projecting this. I think it's fairly idiosyncratic, but like CV and research statement like are probably my first 2 stops. And so I think I just underscore what Jay said, like, you know, think about what's going to be on the first page of your CV. Because that's like the best, that's like one-stop shopping. I can find out like where you're publishing, like I can see what you're publishing about. And so that's like a very efficient resource, I think. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I agree with him. I don't really.
Yeah. I mean, it's
One thing I'll add is that I think we said maybe tailored for business school a little bit differently from psych. I think another one would be liberal arts schools, which are just very different. They're looking for different thing. And I've also heard that they hate it when people who want R1 jobs still apply to them as a backup or something like that. So I think if you're interested, it's useful to signal that you are actually interested, because that's something to look.
It's for liberal arts jobs. You should have a longer like research or teaching statement that's probably like twice as long, and you should probably teach a class. So I've had students get those and they don't get any interviews the year before they taught, and then they teach, get some teaching experience, and they can all of a sudden get like 4 interviews, 5 interviews. So you have to really care about teaching. They really look for that. Go to business schools.
So we will have a moment for questions right after this section. So hang on 1 second. So I want to talk a little bit more about other parts of the application. So as you mentioned, CV is really important. And I know you guys already talked a bit about publications and how quality is more important than quantity, but we do have a lot of questions about publications. So is there, even though quality is more important than quantity, is there a minimum number of publications that you would expect from a competitive candidate? And what are some factors that make a publication high quality? And one other thing that I think is related to this, as you're going through the CV, how important is it that the research topic, that there's coherence with the research topic, that everything kind of follows that same narrative? And I think, Eric, since you're on the,
I mean, it's hard to put a number to it. Like, honestly, if a candidate had like one banger of a first author paper, like I wouldn't, set that aside just because it's one. Like it's tough to put a number on that. Like most people might have one or more or two or three. I don't know. It varies a lot, and it's going to depend a lot on that paper. But if it's,
If it's a science paper, then
GSP or I don't want to like elevate those journals too much, but that's very eye-catching stuff and really hard to get. I mean, for me anyway, impossible to get papers into. So I'm automatically pretty impressed by people that can break into that stratosphere. So I don't think there's a minimum number. 0 is not good. Like, because we want to see like some proof of concept. This person can see a project through all the way to press. But beyond that, like, I mean, I'm going to try. I'm going to aspire to like pay attention not to how many, but to what, and whether it seems high quality. And in terms of like theoretical coherence, was that like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of an interesting relationship with that because I feel like I've always been on the more let's call it eclectic maybe side, which would be a nice way of putting it, where it's probably been more challenging for me than most to create that like umbrella narrative in my research statements. I mean, I think I did it well enough, but I don't think necessarily that like helped me. Like, I do think that it's just cognitively easier, if nothing else, for people to be able to sort of categorize you as studying a particular question. But then again, you don't want to be too narrow. Like, I mean, there have been cases where, Jay will know what I'm referring to here, but where it turns out that if you look, this isn't so much of a theory thing, but it's not unrelated, that a candidate, when you really are paying attention, has used like one dependent variable in like 90% of their studies. And that's kind of a sign that you're like probably, well, empirically, certainly, but also empirically, theoretically, as a result, too narrow. But by the time you get to the job market, I feel like you are who you are in a way. And it's, I found it was too late for me to do anything differently. I couldn't go back in time and be more focused. I mean, I still did what was interesting to me. I guess I would just speak for myself here, that theoretical, and it's because I'm egocentric, like theoretical coherence is not my top priority. When I was on the job market, they always talked, and I hated this term, but you need a brand. And yeah, I always worried because I never felt like I had a very clearly identifiable brand. I think probably if anything, it's come along a little bit in my career, but at the time, it's just like, a bunch of stuff I was interested in. But I again, like, I don't know, what would you say, Jay?
So on the number thing, I'd say there's no magic number. And we've made offers to people with wide variations in number of publications, from like one first author to many, many, many first authors. So it kind of depends on, and not even counting second or fourth authors. So I don't think it's more of a threshold thing. I think you need to have one or two good first author papers. That way you can, because you're gonna be professor, and the university wants to know that you can like come and like do the thing and run the lab. I've known almost no students, only one or two exceptions in my 20-year career, who got professor offers without a first author paper. It's exceedingly rare, and it only happens in probably exceptional situations. So you need one or two, and sometimes universities do. I know a lot of programs that will do a threshold. they will screen out people who have 1 or 2 first author papers and then look at everything else. To make sure that they can publish and have research that's kind of their leading. So that's the first pass cut I see. That's common in lots of universities, and they're often transparent about it. So I would aim for that as your minimum. And then beyond that, I do think it helps to have a coherent research statement. You don't have to have everything fit under one line of work. Like I was just mentoring one of my students who she's trying to fit everything under one line and just didn't work. And so eventually we realized it fits under 2 or 3 different lines, and that all fits under a broader umbrella, like yours might be intergroup relations or something like
Right.
that. And so she's an you're an intergroup relations researcher, has 3 lines of work on 3 different elements of that. And that's entirely fine too, but you need to have a narrative that tells who you are and what you do. Excuse me, and then the last thing is you need to have a narrative that's deep enough to sustain an hour-long job talk, where you can drill down on something and show that you've made sustainable progress on understanding some psychological process. And that's the key metric at the final stage. So people are not going to bring you in unless they can think you can give a talk on that. And we've had some people come in and they have an amazing project, but they come in and there's no follow-up studies or depth to it. And it might be a brilliant project, but it doesn't have the depth that our department likes to see. So I do think like you want a line of research, at least one that you can present for 45 minutes to an hour.
And I think following on that, and I totally agree, like one trap that you can set for yourself is to be so committed to a single, like, let's just say brand, that you end up doing something forced either in your statement or a talk that backfires, where you're very artificially trying to, you know, put everything under the same umbrella, and it ends up feeling forced, you know what I mean? And I think at that point, before you do that, you just come to peace with the fact that you have 2, right? Like 2 interests, and it's almost like a hierarchical factor analysis instead of like a whatever the regular. You know, if you just allow yourself to have those 2 mini umbrellas, then you might find that, well, those are easier to relate to like an overarching thing without having to sort of tie everything directly into this uber mothership of a brand.
And your research
Yeah.
statement does need to include all your papers. Like I tell my students this, you have 1 or 2 side projects, you don't need to try to fit them into a narrative. You can just not mention them. That they're on your CV. They don't have to all be your statement of your identity of who you are. I will say one thing that
If
does.
you have so many that you
Yeah.
have like
Yeah,
extras
yes,
that.
but I will say one thing that in our last couple searches, one thing that hurt candidates is people have like 8 papers on 8 different topics. And there was no coherent narrative whatsoever. And they came across to senior colleagues, search committee members, as too scattered. And so that I do think at some point, it's probably fine to have 2 or 3 lines of research. But once you have like 7 and you have 1 project on each of the 7, there's not enough sense to know who you are, what you do, or how you mentor, or what your expertise is, or what you've made progress on understanding. And that does seem to backfire at some point.
If the reaction is, how in the world did this person end up on all these different projects, because they're like not related at all? And yeah,
It kind of looks like your brand is just to publish papers, but on anything.
or that, you know, you were, I mean, I guess if you're just talking about first author, maybe this doesn't apply, but if you're like on 8 different papers and they're vastly different, then you start to look like you're there for like some form of technical expertise. Like all those use structural equation. And most jobs, not all jobs, but most jobs don't want you merely for your ability to do statistical things. So
Unless they are hiring a stats person.
yeah,
then
in which
it's
case,
at value.
yeah, that's the exception. But I think this problem, like, that's pretty rare, because it is actually hard to motivate yourself to do 8 different things. Like,
It's rare, but
Yeah.
I've seen it more and more recently.
yeah, and it's always a little mysterious to me how, like, what the history of that was. But these are questions you don't want the search committee.
We
Yep.
have time for one more question, then we can maybe
that
chat with
works.
people.
So last question for this. So besides publications, because we know that matters a lot, what are other important experiences and skills that make a candidate stand out? So things like maybe service roles or grants or how active they are on social media. What would What would you guys say to that? So I guess Eric, since you're on the search committee.
I hope like I'm not judged by my social media. That's like, I just got a chill when you said that. Um, regulated moments. Anyway, setting that aside, what other teaching experience? I would say like service is not something we expect of our candidates to have a long history of serving in committees, because as a graduate student or postdoc, you just don't do that much. I mean, maybe you have service role, we have service roles in our graduate program, but those aren't, you know, serving on the social ambiance committee is not, I mean, we love it, but it's sort of, it's not something that needs to go in. If there could be exceptional circumstances where you did something amazing, you know, with maybe a community organization, that can kind of create a positive impression, but even that is probably not going to make the hugest difference. It's going to be research plus teaching is increasingly a plus, like especially teaching quantitative courses. If you are, you know, somebody who's TA'd a grad stats class, some of the folks around here have done that as graduate students. That is something that would stand out to me, I think, because, you know, our area needs quant really badly. Or if you're a postdoc and you did like teaching postdoc for a while where you taught some stats classes. Those are examples of non-research related activities that could make a big difference, especially for certain jobs that really focus on that. Now, of course, if you're applying to a liberal arts job, you're going to want to put, you know, a lot of time into your teaching statement and foregrounding that. Service matters a lot for when you go for promotion to associate and full, but you know, until then, we really are kind of focused on your research and teaching.
Okay. Is there anything you would add, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you get some grant funding, that really can set you apart.
Yeah.
Because if you're applying to research universities, one of the things that you're required to do is fund your research. So any evidence that you can fund your research and know how to do that, huge bonus, but it's hard to get. So you'll,
At that,
but you'll,
your career
but
stage.
you'll stand out if you get it. The other thing I would say about service that I actually, as I get older, look more towards about what is this person gonna be like as a colleague? Are they just gonna be purely self-interested, doing their own work and not helping anybody? Or are they gonna be a good community member? And so I do look to service. I look to the reference letters to see if they're collegial, they take leadership roles. And when I write letters for people from my lab, I have a paragraph on it. Because I want to signal if this person's a good community member. And I'll say like the two of you organizing this, it's the type of thing that goes in a reference letter. Because I want to signal to people that you'd be great to have as a colleague. And I say that, say all the things they did and say, this would be person would be awesome as a colleague. Because guess what? People are going to have, most places have, like even NYU is a 95% tenure rate. So if we hire you, there's a 95% chance I'm going to have an office next to you for 25 more years. And so I actually would care that you're like, not going to like, you're going to show up and help out with things. You're not going to bail on your grad students and be a bad mentor. You're not going to like hoard all the resources for yourself to make yourself look good. And while everybody else around you doesn't get any access to anything. And some people act like that. And so they have impressive records, but they're incredibly selfish. And I would say, like, to me now, I look really, I look and I'll look at the letters and I'll sometimes reach out to the letter writers once it gets to the final stages. And that's often like a big thing at the final stages that I'll bring into discussions. I'll find out about their mentorship and talk about that. I'll bet their collegiality and service, and I'll talk about it at the faculty meetings. Because I think that doesn't get talked about a lot. I think you're right. Most people don't talk about it, but I care about it. And so I talk about it. And I think when people hear it, it resonates with them. They just don't look for it. But
And I certainly look at the, like, and I totally agree, like an impressive record is great, but like, if we're being real, like people care about their day-to-day experience with a colleague, probably more than, I would much rather take a generous, good colleague than whose research, I don't really see what, you know, what the deal is than somebody.
It's a lot during the job talk as well. So before, just being conscious of time, before we move on to the
And
job talk.
reference
Mhm.
letters, I would just say that like conscientious letter writers, and I try to do this, you know, make a very genuine, if you can, and you know, so I can, like, just this person's like great to work with. They're a community-oriented person.
That brings us on to the next section, but before we go to kind of the in-person interview, what happens once you're invited for a job talk, and I'm sure Trini and Mark have a lot to say about that too. Does anyone have any questions on the application process? Anything that we've discussed thus far?
I guess one of the things you mentioned a lot is first author papers, and I wanted to know how much you might weight either co-first authorship versus the recency of those first author papers. Like, if the first author paper, the last one was 8 years ago, does that count as much?
Yeah, recency matters more because we assume it's your more recent relevant work and more diagnostic of what you're gonna do. And then co-first authors are great, although there is always a thing, like if you're not listed first and people are just scanning through, they might not notice it.
You need to make it clear, figure out a way to make that clear on your CV. Because because it is easy to overlook, if you're alphabetically the second of the co-first authors or something like that. Then mark that in some ways. And then,
Or have your letter writers mention it.
yeah,
You can talk to your letter writers and strategize about, like, you might have helped with a grant in the lab, but you're not a co-PI. Get my letter writer, my advisor, I helped with one based on my research he got at NSF. I couldn't put it on my CV since I was on the grant, but he made a paragraph in his letter about how I wrote my research was critical to getting this grant, and I helped co-write it with them. And so your letter writers can often highlight things for you that are more, you can't say in a way that's easy in your materials.
Last also, so,
Last author helps if you're the senior author.
yeah, senior also.
Yeah, so senior author, but you should make it clear that you're the senior author, because some people assume when it's a grad student, they actually did the least amount of work.
Yeah.
So make it clear that if you're the supervising person on the project, that was your role as last author.
You would, I think you would offer if the timing just so happens to work out that the job deadline comes up while you have some stuff under review or in press even, but it's not out there for you to link to and send DOI and, it's less accessible, if you will.
well, if it's in press, put up a preprint, preprints are now completely normative and make it available. Because in press counts as published.
Yeah.
As far as a committee is concerned. For in prep work, I mean, the problem with that is that in prep means a range of things to different people,
I guess I
like
was
that
a little
twinkle in my eye, right?
Yeah. Even if
Idea.
under review, for instance, should we make sure on our CV we say where it's under?
Yeah,
review?
I would, some
Yeah.
people are mixed on that, but if it's under review or under revision, a lot of people mention the journal, and that gives us a sense of what type of paper it is. And especially if it's a first author and it's something you're doing based on your dissertation or something, it can signal kind of what might be the outcome of it or whatever.
I mean, if it's under revision in science or something, that's an extreme example, but make it clear, because if it's under revision, it's probably gonna get in and.
Yeah, we all know that there's an 80-90% chance it's gonna get it if it's under revision.
Right.
And you can say the journal, and if you have a preprint, link to the preprint.
And under review, sorry, I was thinking too much about in prep. Under review is compelling, I mean, because it means that you got the work to, a plausible, presentable state that you felt comfortable putting it out there, and list the journal to show where you thought you could place that.
And didn't get desperate.
And it didn't get desk rejected. Which is an increasingly common process. So, yeah.
Also, the status, so, just really quick, the status of paper changes, you might let the community know. I think that. would be-
Yeah, and that's also Google Scholar and a website are good, that they can. Or you have a link to it, I always put hyperlinks to all my papers on my CV. If someone's interested, they click the hyperlink, it takes them either right to the paper or right to the preprint, and then on the front of the preprint, I always list if it's in press yet. And so whenever you go to the preprint, if it's in press, you suddenly see on the first page that it's in press. So you know it's valid published. And so it allows them to find it if they want to read it, if it sounds interesting and they're interested in you and your work. But also it can allow them to automatically update at any given moment based on what the status of it is.
Yeah, I was gonna say that even if you don't want to preprint it for some reason, you can still just put it on Google Doc, but share the link just with them, and on page 1 it says where it's under review.
Are there any other questions before we move on to talking about the job talk? No? Yeah.
So then in the research statement, obviously it's about the content for the most part of your research, but to what extent should you highlight unique or innovative methods or stats that you do have experience with, or do you let that be?
I like that in the cover letter. That's cool.
I like it. Yeah, more than ever, like, I mean, we don't just want, methods wizards and we want gurus, but, having those skills in addition to like a theoretical point of view and a interesting set of topics is huge. Yeah, absolutely. Highlight that explicitly in your statement. Like I even would put like a paragraph that's just about your methodological breadth or expertise.
Oh, did you have a follow-up?
Sure.
Sure, yeah.
So, I'm just starting my postdoc, so basic democracy word affects the which project I would take. So I could probably take like several different directions, but I'm constantly thinking about this umbrella thing, this brand statement in my mind. So this, like, I'm gonna be struggling at this moment. So if I take this path, probably I can find some umbrella to cover it. But if I take the other two paths, it's hard. But as a human being, we have very different interests. For example, like a psychologist, we observe like behavior in this real world. There are many things like triggers like interest. So for me, I'm a person who is like kind of really hard to stick to only one thing. I kind of like sometimes jump to very different topics, but it's always hard for me to come up with any like umbrella. So I can come up very high level umbrella like decision making to cover all the things I watch, but finding like mini umbrella on that, I have to do some trade-off. Like basically for me, the thing I have to decide is like which direction I have to take for my postdoc, and can I really consider this umbrella thing?
Like one part of you wants to, I guess novelty, right? Like this is not something I've studied for hundreds of hours. Therefore, it's kind of interesting out there, right? Like, and that's very human. That's really tough if you're actually facing like a decision point about the fork in the road about whether to go with the sort of thematic project that maybe seems a bit same old. But do them both. Do them both.
So I was told like maybe I can do that when I get tenure. Like do more
Oh, the more novel thing.
very different topics I have some idea for. It's just they told I coded for until I get tenure, so I can be free.
I mean,
But
I can't believe I'm hearing myself say this because I'm like you, like I get bored with one thing and want to do something different, but strategically, I'm not sure that's bad advice, like that, but at the same time, you're not gonna be able to sustain your enthusiasm for something that you're just totally sick of, right? And I hope it's not that bad with like the thematic project. I mean, obviously it's but
We
Maybe
have,
that's an opportunity
yeah.
for
Yeah.
more discussions later. I think just
I'm just grabbing a
one
water.
time,
by the way.
we can move on to what happens once you're invited for the job tour, which hopefully a lot of you will be in that position this year. Beginning March, but we have a lot to say.
Yeah, so people want to know what to expect. What is it like being invited for a job talk? What does the structure look like, the timeline? I think as attendees, we've seen job talks, but we don't know what kind of goes on the rest of the day. Ashwini, do you want to start?
Yeah. So the structure is, it's the job talk is typically the central part of it. You show up and you give a talk. You typically have like an hour and a half, maybe. That's for your talk and the Q&A. In some places you manage the Q&A, like you moderate it yourself. Sometimes somebody will help you. Sometimes it's entirely in person. Sometimes it's hybrid. But typically, in addition to that, you have one-on-one meetings with faculty. probably like 10 or more, something like that. Meetings, sometimes all the same day, so it's just back-to-back meetings around that job talk. Occasionally it could be a 2-day thing where you meet some people day one and then some day two. There's almost always, typically you go out for dinner with 3 or 4 faculty, and then maybe lunch with students, I think is a common thing. That's maybe broadly the structure. Often there's a Zoom interview in advance, not always, but I think half the time, so you at least meet a couple of people beforehand, and that's nice, that helps. Well, what was the other part of the question? How much, like maybe you said how much, I think the talk itself, you get an hour and a half. There's a lot of variation in how much time there is from when you get the invite to the actual visit. Sometimes, one thing is that often for instance, we're trying to do all the job docs before the winter break, right? So in those instances, you hear back in November maybe, and then have your talk end of November or early December, something like that. So you have just a couple of weeks then.
It can just be a couple of weeks, like I was told, it's pretty uncouth to go below 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Which
2
is
weeks,
just
yeah.
like that's just not nice.
But occasionally they can't do it before the winter break, so then you have lots of time if it's in January. There's variation how much time there is, so it's useful to start thinking about it beforehand, have something like a draft, or maybe even practice your job talks before, so it's not all in those 2 weeks. Then,
Yeah, I mean, do a lot of practice, do as much practice job talks as you can, like, find as many groups people can present to, just to like see how it feels to present and like get feedback on that. Yeah, a couple of other things that came to mind. So another thing is, the questions part of a job talk is really important. Like, that could be the most important, like 15 minutes. Of, like, and so that's when people really see like how you think, like in real time, and not just like the most polished thing that like you got a ton of like feedback on from your advisor or something like that. And so I think, be aware that that's like going to be a really important time to really shine. And
to
Yeah,
that. So
yeah.
if you practice in advance, one of the biggest benefits is that you get a
Yeah.
lot of those questions, so you have answers in your mind and you almost like prepare them, make them better. If in your practice talk you don't know how to answer a question, you get feedback, you talk to people, build an answer, and then in your actual talk, it sounds like you just came up with it, but you
Play that out.
Great question. Really?
Well, here's what I.
Well, I think we have time for one last question. So,
Oh, I want to add one more.
oh, yeah.
Also, like, but also, like, you want to be prepared you can prepare ahead of time, but also be prepared for like unexpected things. Like, you need to be kind of really flexible. Like, every time I've gone to an interview, something unexpected happened. Something happened that like they said wouldn't happen. It like happened. Like, I just remember maybe you guys would like the chalk talk for my interview here. Everybody was like, oh yeah, just like focus on methods. It's a really like concrete thing. And then like I did that, and everybody grilled me on like really theoretical stuff.
So the chalk talk is an interesting point.
Yeah.
Actually. So sometimes you'll actually give 2 talks, like you'll have the main chalk talk and then a chalk talk. We don't do chalk talks in social, but we do in CMP. And so you're joined. And you've got like the CMP treatment that, I don't know if, do you have a feel for how common they are in social? Like,
They're pretty rare.
Yeah,
pretty
not
rare.
that
I mean, this is not just a social crowd, but that's what we know. In cognition, I think far more.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
One thing I learned very late is that in business schools, the job talk format is sometimes a little bit different. In psych, you often give a 3-paper talk or a multiple paper talk where you say, this is my narrative, these are the kinds of things I do, let me give you 3 projects. But in business schools, sometimes you're able to do that if they're flexible, but sometimes they'll ask you to present one job market paper. They have a concept called a job market paper. So when you apply, you identify one paper and say, this is my job market paper, which is a little bit hard, I think, if you're trained in social science, because you don't spend your entire life on this one paper building it. You try to build a line of work. So in the job talk then, sometimes they let you be a psychologist and give a psych-like job talk, but sometimes they ask you to present your job market paper, which means everybody, or at least some people have read your paper in advance and they come and they scrutinize you on this single paper. So it's just a thing to keep in mind if you may have to do that.
Awesome. So this question, I'm going to start with Jay. What are some qualities of a great job talk?
So I'd say in psych, if there's some program of research. So you pose a big theoretical question or whatever theoretical question you have that's broad, try to make it as broadly interesting as you can, because the audience for that is not just your dissertation committee anymore. It's usually the whole department, or at least the whole area. And so you want to communicate why it's an interesting question about human psychology to a broad audience. And then you want to show that you have a series of experiments and studies that have made substantial progress towards answering it. And that you know it well enough that you've ruled out alternative explanations and you're comfortable answering questions on the fly about it. Whether you get interrupted, some departments will interrupt you a lot, or whether there's the 30 minutes after where you get grilled about it. I would say those are the things. And student talks are getting better and better. They look like TED Talks more and more, at least in our last social search. So talks are really smooth and polished and nice. Both of you guys gave great job talks. But once you're in for the interview, your CV doesn't matter anymore. Like it's 90% your job talk and then 10% your one-on-ones. And so at that point, giving a good talk and being able to answer questions about it is really, you're above threshold on whatever productivity metric. Forget about it. Your goal is to convince this audience that your research is interesting and solid and that you're able to, you know it well enough on your job talk is also to figure out, that's why Mark pointed to the questions. They're so important because let's say you work with a very productive advisor or in a very famous lab. You've got all these papers. It's hard for our search committee to figure out how much of that was you. Did you actually lead this? Do you actually understand it? Did you actually solve all the problems? Or are you just surrounded by brilliant people in your lab? And so your job talk is a chance to show that, hey, that you understand this work, that you're the driving force behind it, and that you'd be able to run your own lab at that university and be successful. So those are kind of like the metrics.
I will just affirm what Mark and Jay said about Q&A. It is really important because of the unique window it gives into the way the candidate speaks. One thing that I like in an answer, to be really specific, is, you don't always know the answer to the question. And I actually really dig it when a candidate admits that they do not know the answer to the question, but is willing to sort of reason through the possibilities. And that's almost more diagnostic, I feel like. Well, I don't know, but I guess if you consider it from this perspective, or you model it in this fashion, it's not charming to sort of insist that because everyone knows you don't know the answer to all the questions. And I like it when people are self-confident enough to admit that, but also willing to think out loud in a really intelligent, rigorous way. That's a nice thing. So don't feel like you can say you don't know the answer to a question, but you can't just leave it there, right?
And I'll say that the kiss of death when you're answering questions is lying. These guys candidates who come up and straight up lie and answer. Like they'll say, someone will be like, isn't this theory this? And they'll be like, no, they didn't say that. And I've had my laptop and pulled up the paper and I'm like, yeah, they did. And it's like, so if you don't know a paper, you don't understand a question, you can say, I haven't thought about it. Or can you tell me more about that paper sounds familiar? Can you tell me what they found? And then maybe I can respond to it. No one expects you to know everything, but don't bullshit your way. Because if you get caught lying, people just,
That's kind of what I'm saying.
and I've seen job candidates do that. I swear to God.
It's like, if nothing else, it's not good to be dishonest, but it's also just not a sign of confidence. Be intellectually confident enough that what you don't know.
Well, also you can't trust somebody if they're gonna lie to you about the science they're doing. How can you trust them to analyze?
That's the main.
Not p-hack their data or all these other things.
Okay, so we only have a couple more minutes. I want to open it up for maybe 2 questions. Anyone has any other questions they want to ask?
All right.
No one has an Mark, what are things to look out for with an interdisciplinary position? That's very different to, I think, most other people on the panel. I mean, all of you are doing to a certain extent interdisciplinary work, but you really truly have a kind of split position. What are things you did to prepare for the application process? Things like the talk.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, you have to just it's really important. I mean, interdisciplinary work is really hard because you need to be able to speak different languages, basically. You need to be able to, like, translate one community and another community. So I think being like comfortable with that and really practicing that and being, patient with like different groups about like what they're not getting about what you're saying is really important. Like, yeah, so like figuring out ways to like bridge the like different frameworks that different communities come to study and questions. I'm not sure, like.
How did you appeal to both communities at the same time, I guess, in the same, I assume you did one talk rather than.
Yeah. I mean, my talk, in my talk, I was just very, I don't know, I'm curious what you guys thought of it before.
We liked it.
But I mean, like, yeah, and putting together that talk, I was really thinking a lot about how do I kind of convey the like methodology in a way, but also the questions in a way that makes sense and kind of cover both grounds. And I was just very explicit, like we're doing this is like an interdisciplinary approach, and yeah.
So from the perceiver's perspective
Yeah.
here, like what I really liked about Mark's talk that, where I think not all talks will be fully impressive, not necessarily this sort of other interdisciplinary things, and it gets to why it's so hard to do interdisciplinary work is there's like interdisciplinary light, which is more like a way of talking about something. It's kind of lip service. It's like, and it just doesn't feel like there's much interdisciplinary substance. It's abstractly interdisciplinary, but not concretely interdisciplinary. And with your work, it was clear how like it was just deeply interdisciplinary. It wasn't just, finding a big enough umbrella to talk about some work. Because you can talk about any, I study social psych, but sure, it's cognition too, it's like, but it was like concretely and clearly, truly interdisciplinary. I wish I had a better way of like wording that, but like,
Yeah. I mean, I think, like the flip side of that is that, you got to be careful that you don't come across as kind of just being superficially interested. Because it's so easy to be that. It's so tempting to be that. People do that sometimes. And so making sure that you do have a genuine interdisciplinary point to make.
there are
People
times
see through it.
when it can sound
Yeah.
just pretty much with force.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it was impressive when Mark, like, I'll give you a comic, but Eric said concrete. You would cite papers that weren't just in cognitive psychology, but were in social psychology. You opened your talk with a broad topic that was deep and encapsulating of both fields. And so like you could explain your methods in language that anybody can understand. You didn't get stuck in the jargon of one area and ignore the language and concepts of another. So it's like, it comes across in like multiple layers, but those are three concrete ways that I noticed. Yeah, we have one question, maybe
Yeah.
last question.
Well, also, I just want to really quickly say, like, I got a lot of feedback from both cognitive scientists and social psychologists.
Yeah.
In the WIDA?
Yes, so
Yeah, that's my.
just reinforcing my other, so just reinforcing.
Last question, then we'll wrap it up.
I guess for those that have gone through it most recently, did you have a strategy when looking for, say, job postings? Did you troll Twitter all day long, or is there a centralized repository where you might post job postings? Like, what was your strategy when you were finding out who is hiring this year?
There's like job wiki, that's the main one. I mean, like, I don't think anybody should troll Twitter, like, you shouldn't spend too much time on Twitter.
That's also on this resource, there's a scan QR code, you can access that link as well.
Oh, good.
Awesome. Well, thank you to our panel of faculty experts.
Thank you both for organizing and hosting it. Yeah. Thank you.